I made a goal for the month of June to finish all of my library books, and boy, did I. Hello, my tinglings. So a few weeks back, I was talking about how I got out of my funk, and one of the things I was talking about is the goals that I set to accomplish in May. So I thought I would follow up on that by talking about one of my June goals. And one of those was to finish all of the library books that I had out. I often have lofty ambitions. Books sound so interesting to me. And then I don't read them. I'll check them out from the library and never get through reading them. So I had 6 books, which you can see right here, and I'll go through them with you, that I wanted to read in the month of June. There was one other book I had, but that one I never really planned to read. It was more visuals for videos and that sort of thing. Anyway, so I decided I was going to read all of these 6 books in the month of June, or at least finish them. Some of them I had started but not finished. So this excludes books that I've been reading for my research. I read The Landscape of History by Lewis Gadden. I've been reading Crimes Against Nature, which is a fascinating book, and a few others. But, so I'm not going to talk about those, even though those would be really interesting. I'm going to focus on the books from this goal. So I have 6 books there. We have Call of the Reed Warbler, The Bush, The Merry Adventures of Robinhood, the Howard Pyle book. A pirate book. I can't remember what it is, but it's a history. The Blind Assassin, and I think the 5th Artemis Fowl book. So I'm going to go through those books with you. Now, so only 2 of them. Yes, okay. So only The Blind Assassin and Artemis Fowl are really kind of traditional novels. The Merry Adventures of Robin Hood is kind of a collection of tales. There's not as much anything to be spoiled about. But so I will attempt not to give spoilers on those 2, but I'll leave them for the end as well. So if you are concerned about spoilers at all, that you can stop watching when we start talking about those. Especially The Blind Assassin, I might have a hard time not giving spoilers on that one. But anyway, so we'll start off with our non-fiction books. So the first book we'll look at that I read is Black Flags, Blue Waters, the epic history of America's most notorious pirates. And this was an interesting book. It talks about the golden age of piracy, and it's a historical account, so not any embellishment, and basically purely from historical records, and then reporting what emerged and what is factually supported, what's not, and what's unknown. So it's very, very good, and I'll probably end up doing, there's 3 different episodes in there that inspired me that I'll do videos with, but we'll end up talking about those later. But so this is by Eric J. Dolan, and I think he's done a really good job with this book. It was very good, a bit long in some parts, but when there was action, it was pretty good. So I thought it was a good mix in that way of really interesting and still quite captivating when the subject matter warranted it. So if you like history, books or pirates and you want to know about pirates in America, quite interesting. One of the interesting parts that I took out of this was how there was this shifting perspective from the colonies in America to piracy. So at first, pirates were considered, basically they would get them goods that they couldn't get elsewhere, so they were most celebrated and appreciated in that way. And then as the colonies had more to export, and rather than being the purchasers of pirated goods, they became the victims of the pirates. They had less adoration for the pirates at that stage. And it was interesting to hear about the methods that they used to really shut down piracy, and interesting to think about the lifestyle of a pirate. I'd never really connected it to gangs and mobs, like the mob and the mafia, but that was really the impression that I got in reading this, that it was that sort of skirt the law, do what you can, make your money, and you're likely gonna die young. So it's pretty interesting though. Definitely worth a read. So next we have The Call of the Reed Warbler. A New Agriculture, a New Earth. And as I was reading this, it really blew my mind and really opened my perspective. So it's by Charles Massey, who I've actually gotten in contact with. I may be meeting with him over Zoom, so that would be very exciting. But, so he did his PhD basically doing lots of interviews and talks with people involved in regenerative agriculture, mainly here in Australia. And regenerative agriculture is fascinating. So particularly for me, having a conservation background with understanding ecological processes and everything, it was really interesting hearing about trying to get more of that into agricultural systems, which also from a video that I heard from him, he was saying that 70% of the world's food is actually generated through organic, small-scale farming in the, undeveloped world, but that's 70% of the world's food, so what's developed and what's not. But anyway, that's for another time. So, but for this, one of the most interesting things was hearing about the regeneration of soil. So a big problem in Australia since invasion and colonialization has been compacting and hardening of the soils. And the primary reason I've heard for that has been because of hooves breaking up lichen crusts and making it so that it's much easier for soil to erode and also get compacted. But basically in this book, he's suggesting that in the case studies that he's seeing here, that that's not necessarily the case. That it is overgrazing, so it's the hoofed animals doing the overgrazing. But it's not actually their hooves, but the grazing regime. And so when they've moved them into these smaller paddocks of palatable feed and moving them from cell to cell, I won't go into the technical details that much, but basically it allows the earth to regenerate, and they're actually seeing soil being created in 2 and 3 years, rather than the hundreds of years that you are typically heard for what it takes to create soil. So really mind-bending book, also because it talks about instances of people moving to regenerative agriculture, and so they're still using sheep primarily, so they're grazing sheep on the land. They might be growing crop as well, but where they're actually able to carry more sheep, but they also are improving their biodiversity, so they're seeing their birds coming back, they're seeing platypi swimming in their streams, and everything like that just sounds, magical, more like, to me, what it should be like. But also we do need that ecosystem function, you need that biodiversity, and different ways that people have dealt with the overabundance of pest insects and that sort of thing. Interesting to me because I loved my insect courses as well, so how a balanced ecosystem makes it really hard for pests to take hold, which I did know with monocultures. It's much more likely to get a breakout in pests because their predator is much less likely to have a food source besides the pest, and so they're not really in enough number to eat up the pest if it starts going out of control. So really interesting to hear about people here in Australia making a decent living and restoring their lands and regenerating. And it really got me thinking, because I guess a lot of my perspective on conservation has come from public land conservation in national parks and the like. And so to think about doing more conservation integrated with agriculture really got my brain thinking, but that'll probably be down the road research. But anyway, I'm really excited. It's a very interesting book. I highly recommend it to anyone who has an interest in farming, gardening, conservation, everything. It's a very, very fascinating book. So next we'll talk about The Bush by Dawn Watson. And I'm just going to come out with this. This was the least favorite book of the books that I read. It got a lot of really interesting information. It's a very meandering story about what the bush is basically in Australia. It's a huge part of the identity here. And so he talks about a lot of history, a lot of stories, reports, and he does include indigenous perspectives. He has some respect for Aboriginal people, but probably not as much as I would wish. I should have said in Call of the Reed Warbler, he's trying to adopt some indigenous fire practices on his land as well, so of course I liked that as well. But so this Dawn Watson book, I think there was a lot of very interesting information, but it lacked an overall structure, so I didn't really know why he was telling me this particular thing at this particular time. It just kind of felt like this random assortment of facts. So, yeah. It was interesting, and there's definitely things that I'll remember from it. Not pulling them up right now. Things are very interesting, but overall, the lack of structure made it really hard to follow. So that's The Bush, but we'll just skip past it. Now we'll move on to our fiction. We'll start with The Merry Adventures of Robinhood. Now, I'm really confused about this book because it has a copyright in it, but this was published in the late 1800s, I think, is when it was. Howard Pyle died in 1911, so it was definitely before then. So this was a really interesting book. This is the book I would sit and usually read a tale while I was in the bath, keeping warm in these cold Australia winters. Not that cold as winters go, but it's cold for this time of year for a northern hemisphere brained person, we'll say. So what is interesting to me, so the Merry Adventures of Robin the Hood, they have a couple mentions of Maid Marian, but otherwise it sounds like he's just running around as a bachelor his whole life. So I thought that might emerge, but it never did. So that was interesting. But so part of the reason I've been wanting to, I have an idea for a particular type of map video. And so there is one tale in here that will really suit for that. So I'm excited for that, but I'll probably read a bit more other books on Robinhood. I do think he is an interesting figure. What I found with this book, though, so what I was going to say was, I remember the first probably 10 to 20 pages, I felt like it was just taking forever, because I'll tell you the language. In merry England, in the time of old, when good King Henry II ruled the land, there lived within the green glades of the Sherwood Forest, near Nottingham Town, a famous outlaw whose name was Robin Hood. No archer ever lived that could steal. Let's go to where they're talking. I'll hold the best of you 20 marks, quoth bold Robin, that I hit the clout at 60 rods by the good help of Our Lady fair. So it's a bit heavy in that it's very different from how we talk nowadays. And they say quoth a lot rather than said or replied or, something more modern, I guess. But what I kind of thought was the first 10 to 20 pages, I was like, okay, it'll take me a while to get through this, but it's like any language. If you get used to it, you'll feel at home with it. So by the time I got to the end of the book and there's some action happening, I didn't even really feel the kind of time language difference. I just was right there in the story. So it's definitely worth, if you start this and feel it's a bit heavy, it's definitely worth pushing on. And you will get used to the language. So I thought it was worth reading. It'd probably be a fun book for reading to maybe 9 to 10-year-olds. I mean, there are talks of drubbings and the like. So, violence in the form of hitting people with staffs, but it's a fun book. So next is Artemis Fowl, and it was The Time Paradox. And for me, if you haven't read any of the Artemis Fowl books, they're directed towards a young adult audience. They are a quick read, and they're a lot of fun. They're a fantasy with him being kind of a young criminal mastermind type thing. Kind of gives me Richie Rich vibes, even though that's not really what Richie Rich is like. But anyway, so they've got great characters, quick, snappy dialogue, quick action, a lot going on, but it's not a complex plot. It's, it all makes sense, and it's very satisfying, great, easy to read. I do like them, and this one was no different. That's why I've made it to book 5 in the series, is because they're good. So definitely recommend starting from the beginning, and if you like them, there's a lot of them. I think I still have 3 or 4 to read, so it's great. Now we have our final book, The Blind Assassin. This is by Margaret Atwood. And so this is the first book that I've read by her, Margaret Atwood. She's the author. She's also the author of The Handmaid's Tale, which I've watched but never read. I probably will read it. So, what can I say about this book before I give a spoiler warning? I really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed it after I had read it. It's one that's stuck around with me for days. I've just kind of been thinking about it. It's just been in my mind. And so it does have, in the beginning, it's very slow. If you think about sitting with, maybe not your grandmother, think of your great aunt maybe, and her telling you the story of her life. It has that sort of feel about it, but it's very cleverly written, and so there's a big payoff. That's what I'll say, the big payoff. So I think it's definitely worth reading, and it's worth persisting if you're not really that into it in the beginning. It just takes a long time to lay the groundwork. So now I'll give a spoiler warning. I don't even know what I'm going to say, but I just wanted to be able to say whatever comes to my mind. So it's a story of two sisters, and so you find out in the beginning that the younger sister has committed suicide. So if that's a topic that is sensitive to you, then I wouldn't suggest reading it. And for me, it was a bit odd, I guess, because the character's name is Laura, and I do know of a Laura who committed suicide, but so most of the book, though, isn't really about that. It's just part of the narrative, so something to be aware of. But so it follows the life of this woman through a long period of time, and she's kind of old and telling you what's happened in her life, and it's got this layered narrative structure. So she's telling you the stories about her childhood and growing up and all of that, and then interspersed are articles. So you read an article about her sister committing suicide, you read an article about another person dying, and this person dying, and this person dying. And a lot of those you read quite early on, but you don't know who any of those people are. And so there's that, and then the third story is The Blind Assassin, which is a book that was published, and so little parts of that are interspersed. And it's very cleverly done. And there's a big reveal at the end, and I guess the only thing I can say about it is I saw part of it coming. I kind of was like questioning that for about halfway through the book. And then another part I was pretty sure on about 3/4 through the book. But it was like I hadn't realized that the really big reveal had gone completely over my head. And it was almost like that was a red herring reveal. And that's why I've put a spoiler warning on this. And I still don't want to spoil it too much, even though I've given a spoiler warning. But I don't want to ruin it for anybody who is interested in reading it, because it is, it's just, I was right there with the character as she experienced this revelation in her life. It was being revealed to me as well. And so I thought it was great that she was able to take me on that journey. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's The Blind Assassin. So overall, I've loved my month reading books. I've spent a lot more time reading and even listening to audiobooks rather than watching TV, and I've loved it. I barely watched any TV actually, and so it's great. So I think I probably won't try and read 6 books every month. I'm thinking maybe 3 or 4, but I'm looking forward to having much more to read. So if you have suggestions, let me know in the comments, and I will definitely take them into consideration. Thank you for being with me today, my tinglings, and I will see you on another day. Goodbye. Oliver James uncovers the truth about the science of genetics, that our genes actually play little part in shaping who we are. Today, in our Tingledom Book Club, we'll be looking at Not in Your Genes by Oliver James, the real reason children are like their parents. But first, let me light up our candles. And one you can't see, but we can still see the light of. I just finished reading this book probably in the last week or so. It's quite an interesting book. Oliver James talks through, if we look in the contents, you can see one of the chapters is Why Was Peaches Geldof So Like Her Mother? And I'm pretty sure he's British. And so I think Peaches Geldof is perhaps a British celebrity. I've never heard of her. But apparently both her and her mother died in very similar ways. And so he uses that as a case study for basically how traits are passed on through nurture rather than nature. And The Real Causes of Ability, I think that one, he traces Tiger Woods quite a bit, and the environment that Tiger Woods was raised in, where neither of his parents were very good at golf, but they created this high premium on being a good golfer, and he would suffer maltreatment when he didn't do well, essentially, and that's part of the reason why he became very good. So the book, that is the, it's in the title. The idea of the book is basically that, I think his idea is that pretty much nothing is determined in our genes as far as our personality. He does, in some points, actually talk about attractiveness and those sort of traits which would be more genetic, and that there is more favorable treatment given to more attractive children or people, etc., etc. So by implication, there would be impacts of that sort of genetics on personality. But it's very obvious that he very strongly believes that we are primarily created by nurture. One of his arguments for the genetic side of that is the Human Genome Project. and that a lot of geneticists believe that they would isolate particular genes for personality traits, and that hasn't been the case. They haven't been able to find any real single genes that correspond to traits or mental illness and the like. And so he goes in to discuss what a lot of geneticists are thinking at present, is that it's a combination of factors and that there would be multiple genes involved and that there is probably an environmental component as well. And so basically you might be primed to a particular sort of mental illness or particular personality, and then if you are in that environment, then that will arise. If you're not in that environment, then it won't. So while I was reading the book, and this is the way I approach most things when I'm reading them, I tend not to try to be too critical as I'm reading. I want to see what are people saying, let them kind of sell me on it, and it's more in reflection that I'll really delve deep and see, okay, well, do I think that lines up? How does that all sit once I've actually seen the whole thing? Because obviously with different writing styles or different perceptions or ideas on how writing might be, and I have also done a bit of proofreading, so you can get down to nitty-gritties, and if you're always looking for an overly critical eye, there's a lot to be critical of. And when I'm reading for enjoyment, I try not to be too critical. So that being said, so as I was going along, I thought it was fairly compelling reading. I thought it was very interesting, and it definitely has swayed my thoughts on how big a component nurture is for our personality. I do think it's a much larger part than I did before I'd read this book. That being said, I don't necessarily agree with him that pretty much everything is determined by nurture. He talks a lot about that the genetic basis for personality is often based on twin and adoption studies. And he tries to discredit basically all twin studies based on particular details in maybe one twin study, which I didn't find the most compelling. And my general sense, I guess from my experience with people who I've known who have been adopted, is that, well, for example, one of my cousins was adopted, and he's the only person in that side of the family who has gone to jail. And I think he was adopted as a baby, so it wouldn't be that he was, maltreated and then adopted at 3 years old or that sort of thing that would have led to that. And his personality is quite different from anyone else on that side of the family who is genetically related to me. And that's anecdotal, obviously, and I've done a little bit more reading, though, on adoption, and that it seems like the general consensus is that often personality will tend to be more determined by, the traits will be more similar with the biological parents than necessarily with the adopted parents. So that, I think, is something that pokes a hole, and I think part of the problem with the way that he's presented his argument, and that he's actually made it quite black and white. he's presented it that pretty much everything is all nurture, and there's no genetic component. So it's a really hard sell to actually buy that completely. That being said, lots of interesting things I want to say. So he suggests that why traits run in families is because of not a genetic component, but the nurture component, because obviously that nurture would get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And I do think that's a compelling argument. I do think that a lot of personality traits and knowledge and that sort of thing are learned from your parents, are learned, but I just can't buy that it's 100% or 95%. I think, as I said, I think it's much higher than I thought it was initially. And it is compelling in that way, but I just don't buy that it's 100%. So, the chapter on your role in the family drama, why siblings are so different. We actually have two there, but the theory there is actually quite compelling to me and very interesting. So, one of the things that he talks about is the birth order. So, what he essentially says is that the first child is often quite obedient, much more like the parents than subsequent children. The first child basically learns to get attention from the parents by being like them, by excelling, by being a leader, all these sort of things. And he says then subsequent children, if they do the exact same thing as the older child, there's nothing to differentiate them. And what's interesting about that is that actually fits quite nicely into ecological theory as well, which is niche partitioning. So basically it would essentially be that the oldest child is filling a particular niche, and then the second child, when they come, will fill another niche. So siblings may end up being quite different from each other because they are trying to differentiate themselves. And they're not going to get as much attention for just being exactly like their older sibling. And this is also suggestive of why younger siblings tend to be more likely to be rebellious and to rebel. Which for me, I'm a second child, and my sister is definitely much more adherent to rules. She's definitely much more more obedient and that sort of thing, and I tend to be a little bit more rebellious, a little bit more on my own, do my own thing, and so that is consistent with my own experience. So I definitely think that birth order does have this impact, and that there would be this kind of niche partitioning happening among children, particularly as you get more and more children, they're going to have to do something else to seem different from each other. That being said, he does also make the point that children within a family will still often share personality traits in common with each other as well, because we all know that we learn to socialize, we develop our own ways of relating to each other within the family. And But one of the biggest sources of differentiation and causes of differences in personality, as mentioned by Oliver James in this book, is to do with childhood maltreatment. We don't need this page anymore, so we'll go back to the cover. So, childhood maltreatment, I haven't read more about it since reading this book, but one of the points that he talks about is that there is actually a very common thread quite often with the form of maltreatment that children receive and mental illnesses that they may develop later in life. And I believe it was that there's a strong correlation between sexual abuse and schizophrenia, whereas other types of emotional or physical abuse may be more associated with other types of mental illness. And neglect can cause its own sort of mental illness as well. And to me, that is a compelling sort of figure. Obviously, if you think about not just children, but you think about the way that soldiers or people who are put into very high stress situations, there can often be similar responses across the board because it's just a human way to react to those particular stimulus that's very negative. And so I do find that compelling. All in all, I would say for this book, I would say it's definitely worth reading. It's very interesting, the stories that he takes you through. I found the analysis of Tiger Woods' life very, very interesting, very fascinating to delve more into that. But I would say also to, I guess, always, and this is what I think with any book, is to keep a questioning mind. Because I think I want to come to your own conclusion, I guess, about how valid you think his arguments are. Because there definitely, I was reading, and there definitely are geneticists who are trying to point out flaws in his reasoning. I'm not really qualified to do that, so I won't really touch on that. Only to say that there is not consensus in his direction, I would say. But I wouldn't say there's necessarily consensus at all. It's generally thought that it probably is a mixture of nature and nurture. What was interesting is he talked about in the book that, so he has some psychotherapy training, and his parents were both psychotherapists. And so it was a big topic of discussion around their dinner table, nature versus nurture. So looking into the psychology of his motivation for writing this book, I could see that he may have had one or another of his parents who may agree with him or disagree with him, and he may have found it beneficial to look into this book for that reason. But anyway, that was just an aside. It is very interesting, though. I definitely do think it's worth a read. It really will open your mind about different concepts and can help you evaluate perhaps where certain personality traits that you have come from. So that's our first one. I'm just going to now show you what we'll be looking at next time. So our next book will be The Examined Life by Stephen Gross. I loved this book, so I'm really looking forward to sharing this with you. A lot of insight, so I hope to see you when we discuss this one. The Examined Life. This book is about learning to live. In simple stories of encounter between a psychoanalyst and his patients, The Examined Life reveals how the art of insight can illuminate the most complicated, confounding, and human of experiences. Let's get our candles going, and then we'll get started. 1, 2, and the one you can't see. Come on, light up. 3. I loved this book. This book was really good, and I recommend it to everyone. I'll first say that. So, Stephen Gross is a psychotherapist. Actually, I'll probably go into a little bit of background. So, he's a psychotherapist, and I'm sure not everyone is actually that familiar with what psychotherapy actually entails. I have quite a inside view, I guess, because my love is in psychotherapy, in analysis. So psychotherapists can do different types of therapy. So I'll just talk about from my love experience because that'll be the easiest for me to explain. When my love first started seeing his therapist, he would see her once a week, and she always recommended that they increase their sessions to more than that. And so he's gotten to the point now where he sees her 4 times a week. And that sort of therapy is called analysis. Now, this is all very secondhand. I've never been in a single session. I've never, heard a session, anything like that. So this is just the impressions of a wife who talks to him afterwards. So for anybody in therapy, I'm sorry if I don't describe it well. Just doing the best that I can here. But I believe that the idea behind psychotherapy is to you come as you are. And there's actually a really great story that talks about this, but I'll get into that in a little bit. You come as you are, and you just share any thought that you have, anything that you're thinking about, and the therapist will basically be there to reflect back to you and to help you just really delve into your thought moment to moment to understand where it's coming from. But this isn't therapy that you have for a month or two and you get some insight and then you move on. It's something that is very, very deep. It goes very deeply, even though it can feel like surface level. And it's able to, so your therapist can, almost, if you remember last time when we talked about not in your genes and the impact that childhood maltreatment can have on children as they grow up and turn into adults. The point of the therapist is almost to be another parental figure for you and to give you a parental figure who doesn't give you that maltreatment, in essence. But it's not just about necessarily maltreatment, but about where your needs weren't particularly met, which isn't always intentional maltreatment. Sometimes it's sometimes it's not really overt maltreatment, it's more the subtle things where, our needs weren't quite met. So, in this book, he talks about the experiences of a number of his clients, and then one that's himself and his dad, and then another that it was his friend. And it's actually his friend is the one I was just talking about before the story. His friend went to see a psychotherapist, and it had been 5 years and they hadn't spoken about it, and obviously Stephen didn't want to bring it up because being a psychotherapist, he knew how important that safe space is. He didn't want to intrude upon it, so he waited for his friend to bring it up. And so it'd been 5 years on, and his friend brought it up, and he said, maybe we'll see if we can find it. It's towards the back of the book. Oh yes, I'm being a patient. Here we go. Be in there, 167. Oh, here it is. Tom turned towards me. "You didn't exactly lie to me," he said, "but you didn't tell me what to expect." And so then Tom, his friend, goes on to describe the thoughts that he would have going into therapy. He would think about, should I take the stairs? Because he doesn't like being in an elevator with somebody else. But then if he goes up, 4 or 5 flights of stairs, then he'll be all sweaty. And then he would go into the office, he would get called into the office, and he would wonder, should he stay looking at the therapist or should he lay down? And if he lays down, should he take his shoes off or should he not? If he takes his shoes off, would that be considered rude? If he doesn't take his shoes off and then he puts them up on the lounge, would he make the lounge dirty? And then that might be considered rude. And he had all these thoughts going on just on the way into therapy. And they spent a long time talking about them. And this is what I mean about, it can seem mundane. These seem just like very minor thoughts. But the therapist, in being able to continually dig in and figure out what's actually going on in his thinking at every step, was able to assess and help him to understand that he was looking for criticism. He was expecting that he was going to be criticized for being sweaty or not being sweaty, for having his shoes on, not having his shoes on, for the way he sat, the way he looked, and that sort of thing. And so they came to the conclusion together that he was using, because he was expecting to get this critical treatment, that he was being critical of others to almost preempt them. So it was really interesting, but I love that line with that, "You didn't really lie to me, but you didn't really tell me what to expect." But I think what it was really illustrative of was that every kind of thought that we have reveals our psychology, that the whole basis and understanding for how we view the world and everything that goes into how we interact with and determine to live in the world is reflected in how we think from moment to moment. So I thought that was very, very interesting that we're going through these really simple things and we're able to make this rather unique insight. One of the other stories that I wanted to share with, there are so many in here, I really can't highly recommend this book enough. It is definitely a 5-star book in my opinion. It is very compelling, very good reading. But one of the other stories, there was a gentleman who came in to see Stephen Gross, who was somebody who would very brazenly lie. And he wasn't somebody who really tried to make his lies seem believable. And he wasn't somebody who really tried to cover up his lies. He would just really brazenly lie. And so this was, something that became apparent to the therapist, into the therapy. But why took a lot longer. I think he said it was a couple years into the therapy. When he first mentioned that he used to wet the bed as a child. So this man was the oldest child, and he had 2 younger twin brothers. And the 3 of them all lived in the same room. And so when the twins came along, his mother was very busy caring for these 2 twin children. And they didn't get a lot of one-on-one time, just he and his mother. So he did wet the bed, and when he had this, he knew that basically if his dad knew that if he wet the bed, that his dad would be very angry with this and would take it out on him. And that never happened. So his dad didn't know that he wet the bed. And so he would wet the bed, he would have soiled sheets in the morning. And then every night when he would come back, he would have clean sheets in a nicely made bed. And his bedwetting stopped as his mom died when he was about 12 or 13 years old. And his bedwetting just stopped right then. And it's actually, so they think that probably that's when he started this brazen lying. And it was this connection because basically when you experience somebody brazenly lying, quite often, we don't tend to call people out and say, hey, you're lying. That's not true. We'll kind of silently go along with it, even though we know it's not true. Very, common to have that sort of reaction. And it was basically that reaction that he was trying to elicit, because in a way that was the response that his mother had had, was to ignore the problem that he had and make it okay. So when he had wet the bed, his mom would ignore the problem. They wouldn't talk about it, but she would clean it up and make it all okay. And basically by making these brazen lies, he would get that from other people because they wouldn't call him out on it. They would kind of ignore it and go along with it. So I thought that was a really fascinating insight. And it was something where I could really see how that would work together. How you would have that interpretation. Now there was one more story I wanted to go through, and then I wanted to share with you, I guess, the thoughts that I had about myself after going through this book. The final story is about a child who was probably 8-9 years old. Very troubled. He'd been pulled out of school and put into these sort of remedial classes. And as part of that, he was going to, see a therapist. So he was seeing his therapist, and the therapist had been seeing him for about a year. And he would spit on his therapist every single day. And so therapist would get angry when he would spit on him and then not really know what to do with that. Just that he was just feeling angry. And he didn't know why his patient kind of needed him to feel angry. And he felt like, oh, you could not spit on me, so I don't know why you're spitting on me. So it was really interesting. So he went to see another psychotherapist. It's actually quite common for psychotherapists to be in analysis themselves to make sure that they're not going to have transference of their own emotions and experiences onto their patients, and so that they can deal with everything that must come up in these sessions. It's quite a challenging job, but seems quite interesting. So he went to see this woman who had been a therapist, I think, for 50 years or so, and she'd been working with children for all that time. And one of the questions she asked was that question, why does he need you to be angry? Because I'm sure you're not always angry when a patient spits on you. And he thought of an example of another patient, another child who was more autistic, and when he spit on him, he wanted to, let him know it was okay to make a mistake, and he served to reassure him and make him feel better. And the conclusion they came to was that he wanted him to be angry, and he didn't really know why. And so I'm going to read you a part of that. Okay, let's see. This one was on how anger can keep us from sadness. And page 160. So this is right after he had gone to see the other psychotherapist, and came into the session. The child spat on him. Well, do you have anything to say about that? Before I could answer, he spat in my face. We went inside. When you spit on me, I said, you want me to get angry with you. Because if I'm angry with you, it means I believe you could be different than you are. If I'm angry, it means I still believe we can fix what's broken. He was silent for a moment, and I then asked him, can you tell me what's broken? My brain's broken, stupid. He walked over to the small chair I was sitting on. My brain doesn't work, not like other people's. Sitting down next to me at the low table, he described looking out of the bus window on his way to the unit that morning. Everywhere there were children in school uniforms with book bags, gym kits, and footballs. He recognized many of the boys and girls from his old school. They were growing up doing new things. I don't have a book bag. I'm crap at football. I do baby stuff at school. Did I tell you that my sisters practice their multiplication tables on each other? They're younger than me, but they can do all these things I can't do because their brains work. Mine's wrecked. He looked me in the eye. It's really sad. Isn't that really, really sad? Yes, it is really, really sad. There was a great stillness in the room. 2 days later, he spat on me once more, and then never again. So they were basically both engaging in wanting to still think of him as having power over this anger, that he wanted him to be angry with him so that he could feel like he could change, so they didn't have to acknowledge and talk about the thing that they couldn't change, which was his feeling that his brain was broken. Very heartbreaking and very, very sad, but I think there's a lot of healing that can come in bringing those things out into the open and bringing that awareness. And so reading this book, The Examined Life, shortly after I read Not in Your Genes, really had me thinking a lot about my own life and the experiences that I've had that shape how I am. And I would say one of my biggest things in my psychology is I really, really hate to be interrupted or spoken over. And it really, it makes me feel ignored and not paid attention to, which probably relates back to when I was about 4 or 5 years old. That's when my parents split up, and my dad was working really long hours, and my mom was suffering a bit of depression, and so I was a bit on my own. She was still in the home with me, but I spent a lot of time having to entertain myself and figure out, what I was doing. And so, I think it relates back to that. I don't know. I haven't been in psychotherapy, so these are all just my really rudimentary thoughts about that. And so but I do think that there is a connection between my really strong reaction to being talked over and being interrupted, and this feeling of being ignored, and even to the point of, I've created YouTube channels, and this is my desire for my life, is to create places like this and it's interesting because it's a place where nobody can talk over me. I'm talking to you and you may click off and not watch till the end, but you can't talk over me in essence. So it's interesting to me, I guess, that's part of what I've chosen in a way that I'd like to set up my life is in that way. But it's also interesting because it's also revealed in the way I relate to other people. One of my favorite ways to interact with people is one-on-one, and I always am trying to help people feel like they are listened to. I always want people to feel like they can talk to me and like I will listen to them. And, that's something I spend a lot of time listening to my love and what he's struggling with. And I may not often, it's very difficult with his mental illness, but I may not be able to give the emotional support he's looking for, but I always am willing to listen to him and, hear what's going on with him. Not always, I'm not a saint. I do have impatient and, anyway, I just meant, that's probably more than most other people would. I am willing to listen. Not 100%. But anyway, it was really interesting for me. That was a little insight I got. It also gave me an insight to a problem that I've been having with someone in my family. I won't really say who. I've been gone into it, and I don't want to. More for their sake than for mine. I'd be happy to, but I just, if it's somebody else's problem as well, I don't necessarily feel like it's the right thing to just broadcast that on the internet. But a very significant issue in our relationship that's still ongoing and still has ramifications and impacts to this day. But in reading this book, even though none of the examples were exactly related, there were certain things that just helped me. Oh, well, that's what's actually going on with somebody when they did kind of this horrible thing or this, sort of thing, that it wasn't really for that reason, it was for another reason. And so it's the first time that I've been actually able to understand why this person might have done that thing, because that was something I could never understand. And now I can. And so there's a little bit of peace for me in that I'm not just perpetually now wondering how could you or why even would you do this thing. I can understand a little bit more potentially why. It doesn't really fix the issue, but it does help me come from a place of understanding and at least feel better in myself in regards to the issue, that it's not just this itch that I perpetually need to scratch. So, The Examined Life, definitely recommend. Read it. It's not that long. So it's about just a little over 200 pages. And it's just so good. I can't recommend it highly enough. So if you have read it, let us know down in the comments what your thoughts are, what insights you've had. And let me just preview what we will be looking at next time, which is this: Essentialism, the Disciplined Pursuit of Less, by Greg McKeown. I look forward to seeing you then. Today in the Tingledom Book Club, we'll be discussing Essentialism, the Disciplined Pursuit of Less. Have you ever found yourself stretched too thin at home or at work? Have you ever felt both overworked and underutilized? Do you ever feel busy but not productive? Do you ever feel like you're constantly in motion but never getting anywhere? If you answered yes to any of these, the way out is becoming an essentialist. So before we get into that, let's just light up our candles. 1, 2, and one you can't see. Oh, that's one to burn me. The one you can't see. Number 3. This book is, well, if you can see this image here, the mess, the chaos, everything intertwining, and then it leading to this. It's a visual representation of what the book is all about, which is basically finding what is essential in your life and doing that. One of the statistics that he quotes in this book is, I think that 20% of people end up doing 80% of the work, something like that. And they're most often essentialists because they have figured out what the most important work is, and they do only that work. They don't get busy doing all these other things that don't really contribute. They focus on what their maximum contribution can be. And that's a phrase that he uses a lot in the book, is talking about your maximum contribution. There's a lot of different imagery, and it's if I show you. So there's a lot of this, so you get really key points. Actually, I don't set this book on fire, it is a library book. You have key points in much larger. In order to have focus, we need to escape to focus. This is where he's talking about setting aside time to specifically think. That we need to have space and time to concentrate. There's actually lots of... I love this. A non essentialist thinks almost everything is essential. An essentialist thinks almost everything is non-essential. This was actually a really great book if you're somebody who has a hard time saying no to things. And it's been very, very influential on me, even if I don't actually consciously think about it much. I finished it probably a week or two ago, but it's had huge ramifications for how I actually interact with people and respond to people, that I'm much less willing to commit myself to things now because I guess I see what my most essential things are, and that I don't want to fill myself with all these other things that can keep me busy that may not lead to what I consider most essential for myself. I think there's the undisciplined pursuit of more. So essentialism, one of the definitions he gives is the disciplined pursuit of less but better. So doing less but making it better. There's so many different thoughts in here. The one thing that's, you can see, this is like a chapter intro, but there are things like that. Well, that's a chapter intro, that's a section intro, sorry. I just mean, you can see that it's not just a straight prose. There's a lot of just straight prose, but just the way it's set up. You got these little tables showing you the non-essentialist versus the essentialist. Oh, this is actually very appropriate, because this is about saying no and saying yes. The non-essentialist avoids saying no to avoid feeling social awkwardness and pressure. Says yes to everything. The essentialist dares to say no firmly, resolutely, and gracefully. Says yes to the things, only to the things that really matter. Okay, here we go. So this is actually governed a little bit of how I've thought to approach my YouTube journey, I guess. So this channel is a second channel, and part of separating things out is to make each channel a little bit more focused, because I've had very unfocused channels, which then makes it really difficult for people to necessarily know if this is the channel for them and if it's the content that they want. And that became very clear to me when I did a survey of my audience, and I had all these different segments and they were all coming in together. And so I thought, oh no, I need to split these off so that when somebody comes to my channel, they know if it's for them, not, well, if you love everything, then this is for you. People don't love everything. But that was where I figured out one of my essential intents, more on my main channel than this one. But to make it clear, I used this one. Here, I'll read you this little bit. This was illustrated brilliantly to me by, who does it better? Okay. When I took his course as a postgraduate, one of the assignments he gave us was to evaluate the vision and mission statements of nonprofit organizations. As the class reviewed more than 100 examples, they noticed that some of the most grandiose were actually the least inspiring. For example, one had the mission to eliminate hunger in the world, but given that there were just 5 people in the organization, the mission felt like little more than empty words. Then out of the cluttered landscape of such loose idealism came a statement we all immediately understood and were inspired by. It was from a slightly unexpected place, the actor-social entrepreneur Brad Pitt, who, appalled by the lack of progress in rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, had started an organization called Make It Right, with the essential intent to build 150 affordable, green, storm-resistant homes for families living in the lower Ninth Ward. That statement took the air out of the room. The concreteness of the objective made it real. The realness made it inspiring. It answered the question, how will we know when we have succeeded? And so in reading this book, part of what I came to my essential intent, what I realized in my life, that my number one most important thing for me is to be able to be there for my love when he needs me. He's got very challenging mental health issues. He's got his mental illness that he's dealing with. And I don't know how much you know about my history, but I've been a student for the past 4 years. I was on a study stipend, and I'm now on a scholarship. And that allows me a large amount of flexibility in the way I structure my days. But my heart is really with my tinglings and being able to connect with people through my YouTube channel. And so, and that's something I guess I feel like I've really been missing on my channel, and that I really wanted to bring back in. And so bringing all those things together, I figured that my best essential intent would be to grow a community of 400 committed tinglings by the end of 2021. If I could basically have 400 people who feel committed and a part of my community enough to be my patrons, that's something that would give me enough money to live on, that I wouldn't have to worry about other things, and I could just focus on my channels and my love. And that's really what inspired that. So this really did have a big impact on me for that. And I did enjoy the thinking behind it. There's a lot of valuable information in here. And one of the things I love that he talks about is actually just the value of taking time to play, the importance of being bored, by having time to be bored. This is where our creativity comes. It's important to not actually be busy all the time. And I really do buy into that. The things that I found a little off-putting about this book is it's written almost like a manifesto. So it's not as much at the beginning of the book, and you read about an essentialist, it feels very much like it's over there, like it's someone else, that it may not be you. And so for me, that was a little off-putting, because it doesn't feel like it just draws me in or makes me feel like I just know immediately how to implement these ideas into my life. But that being said, I think it's really, really good for reflection, and I do think it's a book that I would come back to maybe every couple of years to review and just understand more how to make sure I'm focusing on what's most important. And there was a part, do we have the what's important now? Power of Small Wins, I think it's in that one. I don't know if they talk about it here. Anyway, one of the things they talk about was, he talks about a sports team, and that was very successful. I think it was a rugby team, and what the coach drummed into them was that at any moment, what they should be thinking about is what's important now. So if you've just made a mistake, the important thing isn't to focus on the mistake or to try and relive that mistake. It's to focus back on the present as to what is the most important thing you can do in this present moment. And I thought that was very, very powerful. Anyway, there's so much. We'll just go through, just give you an idea of some of the essence. Explore. So, what is the core mindset of an essentialist? Explore. How can we discern the trivial many from the vital few? This is one of the things they talk about with essentialists is that essentialists will often be willing to try more things than other people would be willing to, and then basically put them off to the side so that you actually explore more but are able to focus on those few that are most essential. I love to explore and have a hard time focusing on just one thing because I love the exploration side. But anyway, part 3 is eliminate. How can we cut out the trivial many? And then execute. How can we make doing the vital few things almost effortless? So, I do recommend this, as we read from the back cover, for people who feel stressed out, busy, don't know how to find what really matters. I think this can really bring focus to that and give you helpful advice on how to approach certain situations to make that easier for you. So, I give it 4 stars and definitely recommend you read it. Let us know down in the comments if you have read it or what you think is essential in your life. Now let's see what we'll be looking at next time, which will be Chicken Soup for the Soul, the Empowered Woman. See you then. Chicken Soup for the Soul, the Empowered Woman. My mother said I should be fearless and follow my dreams. If you don't move forward, you're standing still. If you don't try, you'll never know what winning might feel like. So, that's what we'll be looking at today. First, of course, we've got to light our candles. 1, 2, and the one you can't see, which doesn't always like to get lit. The one you can't see. 3. I I remember reading Chicken Soup for the Soul books. I mean, it must have been back in their heyday in the 90s, so I would have been 10, 11, 12, something like that. And I think we had like probably 5 of them. And I don't actually even remember how I came across this book. But I thought, they're generally pretty easy reading, feel-good stories, and empowered woman. That sounds pretty good. So I picked this up, and it's one of the books that I read, which is why we're doing it on our Tingledom book club here. So, I mean, I guess there'd probably be some of you who haven't actually read a Chicken Soup for the Soul book. So, Chicken Soup for the Soul, yeah, they're short stories. So you can see it says 101 stories. Most stories are, you can see, 3 pages, 2 pages. Most are like that. There are some that are a little bit longer, but most are fairly short, and they're just generally feel-good stories. So don't look at overly messy issues, not overly complicated issues. Getting a positive spin on things and reading a story that'll make you feel better, basically. Which is why it's called Chicken Soup. It's essentially, if we are emotionally sick or soul sick, then these stories would be the equivalent of chicken soup to help us heal in that way. So, I mean, for me, I was religious when I first was reading them, so I don't think it was as apparent to me. There is a slight religious overtone in a lot of the stories. I don't think all of the authors are religious, but definitely has a little bit more of a slant that way, which I hadn't noticed when I was younger, but I haven't read one of these books for probably 20 years or so. But overall, I'd say it was a good book. It's not necessarily the most memorable book, but it's not really designed to be like that. Trying to think because when you've read 101 stories, they don't necessarily jump out at you, so I'm trying to think what stories. There was a story about a woman going skydiving. She said, she'd stood on the sidelines her whole life, and then her husband was going to go skydiving, and she said, okay, yep, I'll go with you. And he was surprised, because obviously she usually didn't do those sort of things together. But, I mean, I was happy for her that was an empowering experience, but for me, I'm very it's really interesting. I've talked about this with my dad a bit. I have become much more risk averse. Well, first of all, since I stopped being religious, and since I married my love. And I think there's 2 things going on with that. Since I've stopped believing in God and in an afterlife, I place a much higher premium on the time that I have and the life that I have, because I don't feel like it's a guarantee that I will have another life after this, or that I will have something to go on. So to me, even if the chances are very small that my chute wouldn't open or anything like that in skydiving, for me it's not a risk that's worth taking. And the second reason is because of my relationship with my love. It is something that is so valuable to me. I feel so lucky to be in the relationship that I am. We adore each other. We spend so much time together. We talk together. We support each other. And there are very few relationships that I've seen that are like this relationship, so I do know it is a rare relationship. And it is something I value. I feel very lucky to have. And to me, it is not worth risking anything. I mean, there are very few things that are worth doing that are worth risking it. And so both of us have actually become much more risk averse. When my dad came down with my nieces to Australia, we went to this aerial adventure park, and it was just like one story above the ground in this first layer, and then they have these other ones, and you have this harness, you have this whole thing. But for me, well, I mean, both of us had the same thought. We're just like, not worth it. We went up on the first level, we kind of went around a bit, and then we're just like, this is not worth it. And because, yeah, you know, you can show me this harness and show me that it works, but I also know that these sort of things do fail, and it is a risk, and it's not a risk I'm worth taking. So, I mean, it's different for us because we both sort of share that value and feel that together. I think if one was pushing the other, we would go potentially differently, but that's kind of the boat that we've gotten in together. And I mean, I'm hoping that sort of risk-averse attitude will help us survive into our hundreds even. But yeah, I love our relationship. Anyway, so there were a few stories. There were a lot of stories about women, I guess, finding their independence after divorce, which I do think is an important topic. I have been divorced as well. Not that I needed to find independence after that, because my ex-husband did nothing, literally nothing. So I was already fairly independent then, except I was, you know, carrying a weight on my shoulder. Anyway, that's not what it's about. So it was nice though to, you know, read about people getting out of these unhealthy relationships. I did relate to that. So yeah, it's fairly easy reading, and it's feel good, but as I said, there's not necessarily a lot of depth into what's going on. Let's just flip through because I can't really remember. Nothing's sticking out to me. Oh, that was the other thing. So this is related to Dress for Success. So I think the royalties go to Dress for Success, which is a charity which helps women get into suits, I think, for interviews and that sort of thing. And there were lots of people talking about going up on stage. Oh, I mean, it makes sense because there were actually quite a few, I mean, it makes sense. There were quite a few writers telling their story about becoming writers. And when you're reading a book, it makes sense that you're probably going to hear the story of writers. But I thought it was an interesting editing choice to choose so many stories about people expressing themselves through writing or starting a blog, starting a magazine, that sort of thing, in the writing venue, just because I thought it made it a bit narrow and less approachable. Just felt like there were so many stories about writing and not representative of other areas. There weren't, more stories about becoming a scientist or becoming a lawyer or becoming, everything else. There were a lot of people that were writers, which obviously people who write are going to write stories. So it makes sense, but saying yes to myself. Oh, I think there was a lady who was always doing all these favors for everybody, and then she went to the hospital and nobody really helped her out. They sounded really like they had just been using her. Cold Watch. Working. Oh, serious work. This was a writer, and she would be playing solitaire as she kind of thought through her writing process, which is something I did relate to. It's just that the creative process doesn't always look like work. I find this even with my research, that some of my best thoughts come after I've been doing work, and then I go to take a bath, and it's there that kind of everything will gel. I'm not necessarily thinking about it. It's just my mind is allowed to wander, and so that's when that's when it can come through. Oh, there was another story about I think a woman on Long Island when she had been younger, about maybe 12 or 13, and a man had come up and exposed himself to her, and I don't think she told anybody at the time, and then the next day she saw some kids in the park where he had done this, and she thought that he basically might be coming back up. And so she went in, and then, when she basically saw that it might be happening to other people, she went in and was yelling and calling him out. And so they did actually apprehend him and were able, I think he maybe did get to jail for exposing himself to her. I don't remember exactly, but anyway, so I thought that was a nice story. Just about using your voice and, being a good role model for that at any age we should be trying to do the right thing and, set an example, and that she would do that at such a young age. That was good. But yeah, so that's basically the book. If you enjoy those sort of things, it's, as I said, it's an easy read. The nice little bite-sized chunks, just 101 stories. You could read them while you're on your commute or that sort of thing. And just makes you feel good. So, Chicken Soup for the Soul, The Empowered Woman. I think edited by Amy Newmark. That is it for that one. Now let's see, what are we going to look at next week? First we gotta blow out our candles. The mystery book. No, we'll turn to the title page. Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway Train. Look forward to delving into this one with you next time. Shoveling fuel for a runaway train. Errant economists, shameful spenders, and a plan to stop them all. By Brian Check. We don't have a back paper today, so we'll just get our candles lit. 1, 2, and the one you can't see is 3. This book, I'm currently doing a master's by research in conservation funding. So the author of this, Brian Check, he and Paul Krausman wrote basically the definitive book on the Endangered Species Act. And so that's where I became aware of Brian Check and his work. And I don't actually remember then how I came across this book, but the concepts I thought would be quite interesting. And it is a quite interesting book. So we'll look at, there are 2 parts to the book. So you have part 1, the run-of-the-way train. And this part I really enjoyed. I thought this was very good, excellent quality. Except perhaps chapter 4, but I'll get into that in a moment. And then part 2 is stopping the train. So this is building the case for basically what the problems are with our current economic system. And then the second part is getting into what we can do to address those problems. And that part I wouldn't call excellent. There are some things I liked about it and some things that just weren't to my taste. But we'll get into that. So first we'll talk about this first part, the runaway train. And the whole idea behind this concept is that for the past 100, 200 years, our economies have operated on the idea of economic growth and the unlimited potential for economic growth. That economic growth is always to be seen as a positive. The problem with that idea is that economic growth has a limit. At some point there has to be a limit, whether it be resources or capital, or I forget the other part. Anyway, he talked about this. And having a ecological background and understanding the way ecological systems work, to me it just feels natural that unlimited economic growth doesn't really make sense. So if you think about growth charts that you tend to see represented in our current economic system, you'll always be looking for this sort of upward trend. Whereas if you look at the way that life has functioned on this earth for the past, at least a couple billion years, it always works in a cycle. So you have, this group of organisms that will grow, the predators will then grow, which will then grow what predates on them, but then as they're predated, then these will go down, and these cycles just go round and round. And it keeps a fairly steady sort of ecology. We won't go too extensively into ecologic theory. It goes not quite that simple, but for the purposes of this, that's a simple way to think about it. And so with that idea, the idea of perpetual economic growth is always going to be problematic. And the advantage that we had prior to the current time was that our population relative to the size of the earth was such that we could basically grow and there was always new areas to grow into. But our population has exploded over the past 100 years because of improvements in nutrition and that sort of thing, which are very positive, but we also need to understand that if we have more people surviving the next generation, then we likely are going to be overpopulated in some number of generations. And this is what's causing, problems like climate change, is this idea of economic growth. And that's the goal of our economic systems and societies. Whereas what we need to have is an idea of a sustainable economy that works in this circular fashion, where whatever is considered waste is cycled back in and used to produce new items, and that there is just a circularity to it. And that is what he calls ecological economics, or steady state economics. But his discussion of the issues is very compelling. He gives a lot of great examples. He delves much more than I have, obviously, here into those different topics and the politics behind it as well. That in, for example, in the United States, in a bipartisan system or a two-party system, both parties are the parties of economic growth because it's been politically expedient. What was interesting was that he did note that in surveys done, about 75% of people said that economic growth was important to them. But I think it's 85 or 90% who care about leaving an earth that would be appropriate for grandchildren and future generations. And so that, I think, is quite hopeful, and that we should be focusing more on that, because we are doing so many things that will likely impact the earth for future generations. And so I think we do really need to address that up front and center and create a society that can exist through time. So in this first part, we have economic growth as a national goal. What did Jack Kemp really say, which was about economic growth? What will they think of next, and why? That's an interesting chapter, talking about how as resources, as we begin to see that there is a limit on resources, then economists have been able to use, they say, oh, well, economic growth will be possible through the growth of the services sector, and so on. As Simon said, I'm perhaps not the audience for this particular chapter, where he talks about Julian Simon, who is apparently an economic theorist. I've never heard of him. And so he spent a lot of time delving into and discrediting his theories. But I was kind of already on board, so I didn't really need that. And then Copernicus, Are You Out There? Talks about Copernicus having his viewpoint of the solar system, which was ahead of its time, and he kind of sees current steady staters, or people looking for that circular economy, as the Copernicans of our time. But all of that is just to basically give you arguments and an understanding of why economic growth is not necessarily a good thing in our modern time, and why previously it's been a successful method for us, but how it's causing more and more problems into the present. So I really loved this first part. I thought it was great. When we get into the second part, this is getting into his suggestions about how we can address this issue. And he comes up with a lot of terms, and I honestly was not a big fan of most of his terms. So he thought that we could change the wealthy or upper class and call them the liquidating class. Being somebody who is obviously trying to market myself, being, a channel on YouTube and that sort of thing, I guess I'm more keenly aware of what sort of terms that I think are easily repeatable and just have that stickiness and attractiveness to them. So you can see this, as I was talking about, this sustainable economy, ecological economics idea that he was talking about. He wants to call it the steady state revolution. And I just don't think it's a very attractive name. I don't have an issue with most of his actual concepts. A lot of the concepts I think are quite good. One of his concepts gets into dating and females' role in creating the demand for men who are steady staters, which is a little heteronormative, I guess, not acknowledging all the sorts of different sort of relationships and the different ways that those function. And while I do think that there is pressure that can be put on, I think it's a big ask to put. I didn't really like those discussions. I didn't think that they spoke with nuance about those relationships, and I thought it was rather simplistic the way he spoke about that. One of my favorite terms he's come up with, though, as I said, the liquidating class, the steady state class, the amorphic class. These are all terms. The concepts I still think are good, and I think they should be applied, but I think if we want to achieve a steady state revolution, as he calls it, we're going to need to call it something else. I think it has to sound more attractive than that, because economic growth just has a natural, nice sound to it. Steady state doesn't. Even natural economics or something like that would be better. But anyway. But one of the terms that I love, so he suggests that instead of using the term economic growth, that people who basically buy into this philosophy, that whenever somebody would otherwise use the term economic growth, that you use the term economic bloat. And I love this term. And it's applicable in so many places. Because you think about if you are growing, I actually think about my little pet possum. And, he was growing and we would feed him and, growing was great to a certain extent. And then at some point he just started to put on way too much weight. He was becoming bloated. He actually got liver disease and almost died because basically the husbandry guides don't really give good advice on how to raise adult possums. Anyway, we've got an expert now, so we've been able to get him on a steady state diet. Again, I don't like that term, but best for what we have right now. But he was becoming bloated. It was past the point of growth being useful and to the point where it was detrimental to his health. And we are getting to the point where economic growth, further growth, is almost cancerous to our world. It is cancerous to our societies, and even potentially, my own personal thought is that it could be to the survival of our species in the long term. just because of the huge ramifications there are for our ecosystems if all of the organisms who are endangered do go extinct and we lose all of that diversity. Just could have huge ramifications for how well our ecosystems function. And of course we need ecosystems in order to live our lives. We are part of ecosystems. And so I think economic bloat is a great term to counterbalance that, and it's a very unattractive but catchy way of saying it. And over here in Australia, one of the platforms of one of the major parties was jobs and growth. And so now I like to say jobs and bloat. And I think you really can, because it sounds so similar to growth. I love the term. So I think it works quite well. But as I said, I think for the liquidating class, which is people who are spending way more than any human needs to spend, I think probably a better term, because rich and wealthy, first of all, are 1 and 2 syllables. Once we get to 3 syllables, I just think it's too much. So I think the terms you need a bit more work, but I think the ideas are good. So I do definitely recommend this book. It's not very long. It took me a little while to read because I was reading it just basically a chapter at a time, but only 182 pages. And very, very relevant. It was written back in 2000, and it's really interesting to see, the global financial crisis which came after and that sort of thing. Not surprising, basically, with that perpetual growth idea. And I must say, 20 years on, I think we are still having so many problems. Although we do have more discussion of sustainability. I do think that's a positive, but we definitely have more to go. So, definitely recommend that. That is Shoveling Fuel for a Runaway. Atomic Habits. An easy and proven way to build good habits and break bad ones. A revolutionary system to get 1% better every day. People think when you want to change your life, you need to think big. But world-renowned habits expert James Clear has discovered another way. He knows that real change comes from the compound effect of hundreds of small decisions. Doing 2 push-ups a day, waking up 5 minutes earlier, or reading just 1 more page. He calls them atomic habits. So this is what we'll be discussing today. First, let's light our candles. 1, 2, and the one you can't see. 3. Got it first time that time. This book is... First I'll tell you how I came across this book. I had seen I'd been suggested this video on YouTube a number of times. I'll put it in the description. And the thumbnail said, "Set systems, not goals." And I took issue, I guess, with that immediately, because I have seen the value of setting goals in my life, and I thought, okay, why are they saying this? Why are they saying not to set goals, essentially? And as I looked more into it about what they were talking about in terms of setting came across some writing by James Clear, and then across this book. And it is life-changing. There's really no way to say it other than that. The Atomic Habits method, I guess, is... I'll just go to the little review part. There's so much in here, and I normally get all my books from the library, which it wasn't, this book wasn't an exception, but this book I actually went out and bought afterwards because I wanted to be able to have it for myself to look back on and read back over in future. But I also wanted to have it so I could loan it out to people. So this is the overview, and I really do highly recommend reading the book so you can really delve into that and understand a bit more how everything works. But he goes over, there's basically 4 laws, and you can use those 4 laws to create a good habit or to break a bad habit. So the 4 laws are: make it obvious, make it attractive, make it easy, make it satisfying. So I'll give you the example of the habit that I put in place that's been the most revolutionary, I guess. And that would be our dish system that me and my love have. My love and I have been married for almost 10 years. It'll be 10 years in April. And it's been a bugbear the whole time we've been married, that he will tend to do a lot more dishes than I do. And that's mainly because my main way of going about dishes would be to let them pile up and then do a lot of dishes all at once. Whereas he would prefer more to keep a cleaner kitchen. And so, as I was reading through this book, this was something I was thinking about with my love's mental health issues. I know that having a cleaner kitchen does put less stress on him. And so it is something that I've wanted to figure out, but never really known quite how to do it to work with how I am and that sort of thing. So the system that we have now is every time we go into the kitchen, we'll do 3 dishes, or we have 3 dish equivalents as well if you're really not in the mood to do dishes. But so we have, the other options are to put 7 dishes away, to take something yucky out of the fridge, to take one of our bins out, or a green bin, recycling bin, or rubbish bin, trash bin. I'm an American who's lived in Australia for almost 10 years, so I have interesting terminology. Anyway. And, or wiping down the sides, wiping down the stove, those sort of things, or other things we could do. But the basis is this 3 dishes. And I set this system. It's easy. No matter when I go in, because this was the biggest thing that I wanted with my love's mental health. It can sometimes be that we are in a very drained position because it can be very trying dealing with whatever he's going through. And so I wanted a system that would work no matter how bad either of us were feeling, essentially. So that was the way to make it easy. To make it obvious, it's basically, for me, I feel like as soon as I've passed the threshold of the kitchen, it's time to do that. So it's very obvious you walk into the kitchen, you can see the dishes. The dishes are out there. So it's very easy to link that in and make it obvious. To make it attractive, that is actually, it's hooking in to something that's already attractive. Usually if you're going into the kitchen, it's to get something to eat or something that is usually pleasurable in that way. Maybe to sate thirst by getting a drink, something like that. So it's already, if I put the dishes, just 3 little dishes in front of that, then I still get the thing I came in for. So it's still very attractive. And then it is satisfying because as the dishes get done and the kitchen is kept clean, it's very satisfying every time to just feel the cleanliness of the kitchen. So that's in essence how I've done that. And I've used this actually in a lot of other areas, and I won't go through all of them. But I did want to share that one because that was the first one. It's the one I've been doing the longest. I probably read this a couple months ago. And one of the greatest things actually about this dish system, but again, it's because one of his recommendations is that any habit you want to establish, to start it off, make it take less than 2 minutes. And with our dishes, we've done that. It takes about a minute to do 3 dishes, I think. And so it never takes more than 2 minutes, so you can always just get that done. So that does help it feel easy. But anyway, the other part I wanted to talk about is it's about identity. So early on in the book, he talks about the 3 layers of behavior change. You have identity, processes, and outcomes. And in outcome-based habits, we're generally trying to change our outcomes so that will impact our processes, and that we hope that will sometime change our identity. And he says with this, if you maintain the same identity, this can be often why when you set a goal, you will go along and, do all the things required for that goal. But then as soon as you achieve that goal, you will stop doing those things. And that's because your identity hasn't changed. And so you are basically going back to your default identity. So what he says is that the best way to establish your habits is to actually start from the identity and work your way out. And doesn't sometimes for identification, it may not be the identity that you want to start with. But for example, if I was looking at our dish habit, I did institute this as well. I've always thought of myself as a messy person. I have never been a clean person. And so that's part of my identity. So even when I try and change my outcomes or processes, if I'm not getting into that identity, I'm going to revert to form, in essence. And so with this, I have started, and I think it was like my first day doing it, and I was talking to my mom, and I told her, I'm a clean person now. I don't think she quite knew what to make of that, and I think she was probably a bit skeptical. But I think she'd be quite surprised with how much cleaner my house is now. But anyway, and what he says though is if you start telling yourself that you are that thing, or ask, basically, if I want to be a clean person, I might ask myself, what would a clean person do? And as you continually go through that process, you will when you create those habits that are easy, attractive, satisfying, and obvious, then as you do them, you actually confirm to yourself that your new identity is true. So when I go in multiple times in the day and do dishes, I confirm to myself that I am a clean person. And so that builds that in. And so I notice things around. So when I just recently instituted, I've always had an issue with my clothes. So I take them off when I shower, and they're not really dirty enough to put in the hamper, but I don't want to hang them back up because they're not 100% clean either. And so just last weekend, I was looking at addressing this issue, but the awareness and the idea that was an issue that needed to be solved came because I have the identity as a clean person, and so I feel this dissonance that I'm not being who I am in essence. So it's really interesting. We've also started making our bed a lot since then. But the thing I came up with for that, I've been reading all around, and it seems like it's actually an issue a lot of people have. They have a chair or a pile of clothes, and it's these purgatory clothes that people don't know what to do with. So I've actually ordered a little rack that I can hang on the back of my bathroom door so that I can hang up my clothes that are still kind of in rotation. And then when it's washing day, I'll just take everything off the rack and those go into the wash. So it's made it a lot neater. I haven't even got it yet. I've got it over a towel rack right now. And it's really making a difference in how the bathroom feels. Anyway, we could go on about habits forever, but so this is a really, really good book. We'll go over. So I don't think I even talked about why it's called Atomic. So if you think about atomic bombs and that sort of thing, very, very tiny thing changes. So it's just tiny changes, and then that sets off a chain reaction, which has a massive and huge change. And that's what this idea is if you make these really easy changes, the biggest thing is actually getting the thought behind the systems to figure out what the best systems are to put in place. But yeah, so if you get those systems in place, you can see huge difference. So the parts of the book, the fundamentals, why tiny changes make a big difference. The first law, make it obvious. Second law, make it attractive. The third law, make it easy. The fourth law, make it satisfying. Advanced tactics, how to go from being merely good to being truly great. One of the other concepts that I really liked from this book was the idea of what is something you can do today that will change your life forever, basically. And it's just little things. It's when you can identify those choices and make those choices. And they can be really simple things. So for me, one of the biggest things that I did was went through my email list and unsubscribed from all of these emails that I never looked at and never received, so that my inbox wouldn't be chunked up with those emails. And yeah, it made a big difference. So this is not just a 5-star book in my opinion. This is a book that does belong on your bookshelf and is worth reading again and again and loaning out to friends. It's very practical. It's very helpful. If you have a habit you want to set out, this will help you be able to put that habit into place. It's a very, very effective system. So I can't recommend Atomic Habits highly enough. So that is it for Atomic Habits. Let's see what we'll be looking at next time, which will be Office Politics by Oliver James. Perhaps not quite as positive a review as today's. Hope to see you then. Goodbye. Office Politics: How to Thrive in a World of Lying, Backstabbing, and Dirty Tricks by Oliver James. Perception is everything. The modern working world is a dangerous place where game playing, duplicity, and sheer malevolence are rife. Do talent and hard work count for nothing? Is politics everything? This book reveals the secrets for not just surviving, but thriving in the office jungle. So we'll get into our review. Let's light our candles. 1, 2, and the one you can't see is 3. Office Politics. I got this book because, if you remember a few little while ago, I read the book Not in Your Genes by the same author, Oliver James, which I thought was a rather interesting book, even if I didn't end up agreeing 100% with the conclusions. I thought it was still a really compelling, interesting read. And I thought his writing style was interesting enough, so I thought, okay, he's got a few other books. I'll read this book on office politics. If we look into the contents, you have part 1 is coping with toxic colleagues and professions. And I think this is a helpful portion of the book. I definitely liked this portion better than the other ones, but still had problems throughout, but we'll get to that. So he talks about triadic colleagues, so people with the triad of basically 3 personality traits that are fairly toxic. So psychopathy, Machiavels, and narcissist. And so my father-in-law is a narcissist with some probably psychopathic tendencies as well. And so I definitely have had exposure. We don't have contact with him anymore, but have had exposure in a close way, and also seen the dramatic impacts of these sort of personalities on my love, being one of the major causes of his mental illness. So I didn't need any convincing about the problems in these sort of personality traits, and it was interesting for him to discuss the way that American society, but other English-speaking societies as well, as we've become much more individualistic, there's actually been a rise in narcissism, and you're much more likely to find triadic traits at the top levels of management in many corporations and companies. It presents a very depressing view of the world and life. And I don't even know how to address it. Improve your office political skills. I mean, the biggest indication to me is this first one, saying the importance of acting. He is... it gives me a slimy feeling reading this book. When he talks about the tactics and strategies for office politics, kind of schmoozing here, maybe telling a white lie here, or, a black lie if intended, just a straight up lie. I'm a very honest person. I was raised in Mormonism where you're taught not to lie at all, essentially. Except perhaps with lies of omission, people might say, and so even though I'm not Mormon anymore, I still have a very strong value of honesty. Honesty is very important to me. Having had exposure to my ex, who I think was a sociopath, I don't know, but he definitely was towards a negative end and a bit manipulative. And, dealing with my father-in-law, I'm not as naive, I guess, as I once was to think that there are no bad people, and not that I thought there were no bad people, but just that, these negative traits are more common than I might hope in society. But, and, if what he says is true, and that these things are very common among the leaders of our companies and businesses, which wouldn't surprise me either, I still feel like he doesn't really address how you can basically chase, success, but still be a moral person. And I guess that is something that is important to me. I don't want to sacrifice my morality for position. My ambition is not such that is something that I'm willing to do. I'd rather be happy with myself at the end of the day than, have acquired extra things. So it just presents things, and even the way there were probably a couple, I think the way he did his research for this book was he conducted interviews, I think, with about 50 different people, and he was noting how people would basically engage in office politics without necessarily being aware of it, and, that they may be deceiving themselves and that sort of thing. But it just really grated me the way he presented things. It was almost like he made, it felt very black and white. It was like, okay, either you're engaging in office politics or you're not. And he made anything that felt like you're engaging in office politics as kind of slimy and yucky, but at the same time encouraging you to do so. And I didn't feel like he necessarily delivered on the promises that he made in the book as well. He talks a lot about how office political skill is usually one of the largest determiners in whether somebody will basically rise through the ranks or not. Which may be fair enough, but he also talks that he's going to help you improve your office political skill. And I think when he doesn't actually address head-on this orality issue, if you are somebody who cares about being a moral person or doing the right thing, or, not taking advantage, not pushing your advantage over others, it doesn't get at that underlying reason at why you might not be navigating office politics as successfully as somebody who has no morals. And it's kind of a cluster, and it's unclear with a lot of different things. He talks about how he talks about how in the end, emotionally healthy office politics. It feels like the whole book he has spent telling you basically how the psychopaths and the narcissists navigate, and showing you the tricks that they use, and basically encouraging you that if you want to succeed, you kind of have to do the same thing, is a lot of what he's saying in the book. But then here he says, you have to be aware of your own emotions, of your own sense of morality, and work within that as well. When he hasn't really given you any indication throughout the book of how you would actually do that. I don't know, it's also, I don't have a lot of respect for people who get their positions through these things. I definitely, when I worked in tech support, I knew definitely people who were promoted and brought up because of ingratiation, maybe a little bit of go-getting, but these sort of things, whereas when you're in a management position, to me the most important thing is not really how you're interacting with your boss. It's what sort of results and environment you're creating for your underlings. And so this is something that I've always thought, because my love and I have at different times talked about potentially, starting our own business or that sort of thing. And so I've always thought that if I was in the position to be choosing managers, I would choose managers based on reports from their underlings, not the people they're reporting to. Now, obviously, there are issues with that, because just keeping your staff happy isn't necessarily mean that you are doing what you need to do, but I think you can read between the lines there if you actually consult enough of the staff that somebody is overseeing. Because if you can be pointing out feedback and helping people improve in ways that they need to, and they can feel positive about that, that's better than them feeling negative about that anyway. So, but, in this dirty trick, it's really the contrast between these two, which is right next to each other, dirty tricks and then emotionally healthy in Dirty Tricks, he's talking about when you might want to use blackmail, outright deceit. I think he touches on bribery, but doesn't actually go into it. He says other people will use these things, so you need to be aware of them. And you may find a time where you may, think it's appropriate to use them. Now, I feel like I'm going to come off as having a very black and white sense of morality, and that's not necessarily the case. I do think that if you're dealing with segments of society or individuals who operate in a certain framework, so where these sort of things are very common, then it can be necessary to engage in that sort of thing. But he doesn't really make it clear that it's dependent on basically the morality of the environment that you're working within. I don't really have any issues with police going out to potential criminal organizations and trying to infiltrate them through deceit. I don't have a problem with that. Importance of acting, very big there. You need to be able to act. So, it's not a black and white. It's not something I think I could do myself, but I do understand the need for it within our society to combat, undesirable things going on in society. But that being said, if I was to have done all of the research that he had done, spoken to all of these people, and to see that we are increasing, these levels, in my book, I would want to be arguing for how we can shift to what I would consider more morality, how we can discourage more of these sort of traits rather than encouraging more people who are naturally moral to kind of step into these immoral areas. So I'll read through, we'll just touch on briefly, is emotionally healthy his politics. Because this is something, he actually touched on this in his other book that I read as well, was what he considers emotionally healthy. And anyway, so we'll just discuss some of that. Emotional health is the sense that what is happening now. It is first-hand, immediate. You are, as the sports commentators put it, in the zone. I do agree that the ability to drop into the present and to be focused and present in the moment is a sign of emotional health and is something that can improve our satisfaction in life. You are real rather than false. You know what you are thinking and feeling. I agree with that. Again, a lot of these things feel very contrary to basically, the last 200 pages, what he's been talking about. But yeah, I do agree with that. You have your own consistent ethical code, which enables you to distinguish right from wrong. You have the capacity for insight into your own actions. Yes. In moment-to-moment dealings with other people, you are a good judge of what they are feeling and thinking. You are adaptable, but without losing yourself. Your real self is as close as possible to the one you are presenting to others, depending on what is feasible. If a lie is necessary, you lie. It's really, really interesting to me that he considers lying an essential component of emotional health. I don't disagree with the other parts of this section. Good judge of what others are feeling or thinking. you're adaptable without losing yourself. I mean, I think we all adapt. We're all different depending on the circumstances we are in. And that's natural, just different parts of our personality are brought out by different people's personalities, different environments. So we're able to adapt to those, but still being able to maintain that solid sense of self. And I don't then know how that flows into if a lie is necessary. You lie. How has he come to that conclusion? But anyway, I think that's my main issue with it. We'll look at the rest. You are spontaneous and always searching for the playful way to handle things. You are not bogged down in needy, childish, greedy game-playing manipulation. So he says this, but at the same time, throughout the book, he's talked about ingratiation, doing favors for your boss, basically being a brown-noser and a suck-up. Which I'm not saying it's not effective, but I just don't have a lot of respect for people who do that. You may suffer depression, rages, phobias, all manners of problems from time to time. You make mistakes, but because of your emotional health, you are far better at living in the present and finding the value in your existence, whatever is going on, making you resilient. Sure. And when people leave your company, they often feel better, able to function, more vivacious and playful. Your emotional wellness rubs off on them. You are no martyr, but you are widely regarded as a valuable contributor to your social and professional circles. So, it's really interesting to me that he's been working on this and put this together for, he said in another book, How to Improve Your Emotional Health. And he's put this in this office politics book, which feels like a lot of times telling you to be false. Maybe stretching your ethical code. You're a good judge of what people are feeling and thinking, but rather than necessarily just being empathetic, you are trying to find how that can benefit you, not just to be there for other people. It just, as I said, I felt slimy for the most part reading this book. It just felt icky to me. It felt very yucky. I didn't like it. It did talk about, as I said, triadic behaviors, and I do think being able to identify those sort of personalities is highly important. My love has some mates, and one of his mates always will bring, people he's met at work or that sort of thing, occasionally. And he has brought this one guy in, and both me and my love just immediately are like, oh, no, like, he told this story about being with somebody in a boat, and I think how he knocked her over in the boat, and we didn't laugh at all because we're just like, you're basically telling us you're a straight up psychopath, with this story. And then he also then said, oh, it's interesting, some people respond this way or respond this way, and it sounded like that's how he kind of divides people in his mind as to like who's gonna buy his crap and who's not. It's just the way. Anyway, I mean, I'd say he's probably a psychopath. I'm not a professional, I don't know, but I don't want to be around him. I know that because I just didn't like him. Anyway, so I think, but all of his other friends think, oh, he's fine, and, it's alright, and I think that's a little naive, but anyway. So I do think being able to identify these negative traits quickly can benefit you so that you can basically stay away from those sort of personalities, because they are very toxic and do not generally make you feel more able to function, more vivacious and playful after being around them. They'll generally make you feel a bit worse. And that's on the positive end. Otherwise, they may be abusive to you, take advantage of you, and, well, the prisons are filled with psychopaths and that sort of thing, who often are murderers as well. So, for me, I would just like to take a nice wide berth away from people like that. But I'm sure that there are other books that actually discuss those personalities without almost encouraging you to take on some of their traits. So, I'd probably give this 2 stars. It was still readable. It flowed all right. It just made me cringe the whole time. I definitely did not like it. It made me feel icky. So, thankfully, we are done with this book, and our book for next time is going to be Witches. To Sell is Human, the surprising truth about persuading, convincing, and influencing others. Hope to see you then. Hopefully a more positive review. Goodbye. If you're anything like me, then you've probably had certain times in your life where you've been on the endless scroll through social media. My particular social media addiction is Facebook, and never gotten that much into Instagram, Twitter, that sort of thing, but I have spent a lot of my life on Facebook. And so that's why when I was at the library and this title jumped out to me, Why Social Media is Ruining Your Life. Now, it was interesting for me, just before I get into the book a little bit, interesting for me because I actually, over the past couple of years, I've been trying to phase out my social media use. So I've been keeping my phone away from myself during the day, and this year I've started where I am successfully, last year, I'm still thinking it's 2020. In the middle of last year, I started basically getting so that I don't check my phone first thing in the morning. And so this was, very interesting for me because I'm a little bit further along the kind of ditching social media path than even the author is. But so it was quite interesting. But of course, first we'll light up our candles. One, two, one you can't see. It's three. So, this book is talking, so she's actually, I think she's, she's worked in the fashion industry and had work as an influencer, I think, as well. She's run her own business, lots of different things like that. And so she goes through an introduction and then basically breaks down these different parts of our lives that are being negatively impacted by social media. our identities, body image, health, relationships, motherhood, career, and politics. And so for each of these, she does also highlight the positive impacts that social media have had. So when it comes to identity, we think about people who are in minority groups and being able to connect with other people having very similar experiences is one of the powers of the internet and power of social media. And so for me, I still find that all that taken into account, I don't think it's really a 50-50 as far as social media goes. I think it's more of a 90-10, where I think it's 90% negative, but there are some positives there. And it's really interesting because she does talk a little bit about the history and, how we got onto these things. And I remember getting my Facebook account back in, probably 2006, 2007. And back then it was just kind of, a fun way to interact with other college students. But obviously that's changed through time. And the thing that I notice a lot is that when I'm on social media, I tend to, there's people want to get your attention, and because your attention is currency on the internet, and your data is the currency that the internet is using as well. But one of the ways that it's effective for people to get your attention is to inspire feelings of outrage, which I think actually gets into the politics as well, but she doesn't necessarily talk about that. And I think, social media, I find my life is a lot better. I'm reading a lot more books. The whole reason I have been able to create these sort of videos is because I'm reading more, and a lot of that time is time that I used to spend on social media, where you feel like you're getting to know things, but you don't actually end up knowing that much. You learn so much more from reading a book. Anyway, I could probably talk forever, so we'll just run through. So identity. One of the things that I found really interesting in the identity section was that she talked about how in previous generations, you would, if you were, you might be known around your friend group as the, person who likes to make cakes, and you make gorgeous little cakes. But in the social media generation, it's like you're not just kind of finding your status within this realm of, 10 or 12 people, or, even a group of 100 or 200 people. Your identity, in order to really feel like you're carving out a strong identity, you're competing in some ways against everyone who's ever everyone who exists, and you are comparing yourselves to them. And it's not just that, you're not just comparing yourselves to, them day to day to day. You're comparing yourself to the best version of themselves, because social media allows us to curate what we present to the world, which actually gets into the relationships part. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that she was talking about is that the younger generations who are growing up on social media and are nervous about having to go to a face-to-face interview. And we're all nervous for those sort of things, really heightened levels of anxiety, high levels of anxiety. And it's because they're not used to having these conversations. They're not used to interacting with their friends that much face to face. Almost everything's on text messages or Snapchat, or I'm too old, I'm going to age myself by trying to say these things, but whatever. On our phones. She did say that with relationships, friendships as well, that people in that younger age bracket aren't dating very much, and they're not really hanging out that much, spending a lot of time out with their friends, as much as the previous generations have. And I guess that made me sad, because I think, those are the good times in life. It's really hanging out with your friends and that sort of thing when you're at that age. Let's talk about your health. As soon as I say that, your health, I immediately am trying to sit up taller, because I do know that, social media promotes that text neck, so turning our neck forwards, which is bad for the posture, and it's bad posture promotes a lower mental health. The more better posture we have, the better we generally will feel about ourselves, and there's all sorts of health benefits to having good posture as well. And so something that really addicts you and draws you into this constant scroll, bringing your head down, but it also makes us less active. It makes us less, and it's really bad for our mental health, because it does promote comparing ourselves to others. And even if we feel like consciously we know that, these might be not, this isn't necessarily reality, subconsciously we're comparing ourselves to all the images and all of these stories that we're seeing, and thinking in some ways that we're not good enough, which gets into body image as well. The body image and health go together there. And so there's all sorts of ills that happen. One of the things that I found really interesting when I started going off of social media was that my mental health actually took a big dip. I was making a concerted effort to be off of Facebook more often, and I was feeling a bit depressed afterwards, and I thought, kind of what's going on here? And the connection I made is that because I wasn't getting that constant stream of dopamine hits, that my mood felt lower. And so I guess that's something, if you are somebody who wants to try and get off of social media, just something to be aware of. My love is actually going through this sort of thing right now, that he thinks it's impacting his low mood. Obviously he has mental health issues as well, but going off of social media, it really can decrease the dopamine hits. But over time, I can attest to this because I've been off social media for longer, it does allow you to then more thoroughly enjoy things out here in the real world. So I definitely think it's worth it, but be prepared that you may have a month or two of acclimating to that lack of dopamine hits, and that's just a part of the process. But anyway, career and money. Obviously, the whole point of all of these free sites is to advertise to you, and to get you to spend money. And for a lot of things that you probably don't need, I think about kind of the flex lifestyle, showing off all these extravagant things. And you see people who potentially look, like you, like a regular person, not, these really people with really glamorous jobs or that sort of thing. And so maybe it makes you think that you should be having those things as well. And it definitely contributes to our modern consumer economy. And I don't think, because to me, I think the number one thing in life, happiness can be fleeting, but I think if we can find things that can promote satisfaction in life, I think satisfaction is what we should be aiming for. And a lot of these things are making you want what you don't have and not necessarily caring that much that you're satisfied when you actually get it. Politics, there have been a lot of things spoken about politics, but one of the big emerging things of research is talking about how we end up in echo chambers. We don't get exposed to different ideas. And the real thing that I've noticed, having different viewpoints, is that pretty much never in a social media conversation does somebody's mind change. If somebody comes from a place of curiosity, they come to ask a question, basically they're asking for their mind to be changed, then yes, it can be, but that is very rare. Whereas I think when you bring differing viewpoints together in a face-to-face interaction, you can definitely change people's minds, and your own mind can be changed at the same time, and you can understand people better. We're just not getting all of those other cues that really contribute to really winning hearts and minds. So, yeah, this book I found quite interesting. She does go through lots of research on these different topics, and and touches on the science behind it. She gives you all of those data-driven reasons while mixing in her own stories. And while I thought it was interesting at the end, she was talking about a more moderated level of social media. And I guess I've gone a bit more extreme in that I don't feel like I want really any social media in my life. Still interesting, and I think it's probably more accessible to more people to have it written by her, who is a bit more enmeshed in that whole social media lifestyle in that way. So it's definitely worth reading. Lots of interesting information, but I would encourage you, if you do read it, to draw your own conclusions about what you should do. And just because she's still spending a lot of time on social media doesn't mean that you have to, and that it may be best for you to consider making a break. That being said, I'll be full disclosure about what I do. One of the things I'm actually trying right now is to get it so I'm not checking my email until later in the afternoon. It's like email has replaced that, even though I don't get a lot of email, so I'm going in constantly checking my email and not getting that. And the same thing is, I am still on YouTube, obviously, making this. And YouTube, I do find I like YouTube. It's people put a lot of time and effort into making videos. They're putting their thoughts together. It's not the same as interacting in text as well, because you get to see all those visual and voice cues. So I do enjoy that. And so anyway, I do spend a bit of time checking my comments, more for my other channel than this one, but spend a bit of time checking comments. So that's another thing I'm pushing to later in the day, because it can get my mind into a certain sort of mode. So if I push it to later in the afternoon, I generally find that more beneficial, so that I can stay in that longer attention mode in the beginning of my day. So, why social media is ruining your life? I definitely think it's relevant to 99% of people in our modern lives, and I give it 4 stars. Now, next time, you're looking at Stop Playing Safe. Rethink risk, unlock the power of courage, achieve outstanding success. Margie